Going to be talking this evening with Frank Gaffney, repeat guest, national security expert, founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Security Policy, online at centerforsecuritypolicy.org, about a variety of issues. Good evening, Frank.
Good evening, Jim.
Good to have you on. First of all, tonight we're going to be talking about a fellow by the name of Tommy Robinson. I think that probably most Americans are not aware of this name, but you should be.
You should indeed, and I suspect you will be in due course because I have the feeling that we're going to hear a lot more about him. Tommy Robinson is a regular Englishman who felt moved by what he saw going on in his country to challenge both the authorities in government and the police and the elites over the accommodations that were being made to what I think of as Sharia supremacists, which is to say, not all Muslims, but many of them. In the case of Britain, it's generally the case that they've come from someplace else, principally South Asia, and who have demanded all manner of concessions and taken terrible liberties, notably in the practice that's come to be called grooming gangs, whereby young girls and women are British young girls and women have been subjected to rape, enslavement, and sex trafficking. And he went to jail recently for reporting on a trial involving such individuals. And fortunately, after 2 months of pretty brutal incarceration, has been freed at the insistence of an awful lot of Brits and other people around the world over what was really a travesty, the suppression of his freedom of speech and more to the point, the public's right to know what is going on in their country.
Yeah, by brutal, I mean we don't ordinarily think of Britain as a place like, let's say, like the Turkish prisons. I mean, right. How brutal was this treatment?
Well, according to his account, he was kept mostly in solitary confinement, but oftentimes in prisons in which he was subject to verbal and, in some cases, other kinds of assault at the hands of a substantial Muslim population in the prison.
He was not really segregated from that population?
Well, I think that for part of the time, at least, he was. But interestingly enough, as I understand it, he was moved from a prison that had a relatively low Muslim population to one that had a higher population. For a time, his jail cell was left unlocked, which put him at great risk of retribution from the Muslim population because of their enmity towards a man who had been described as a notorious Islamophobe and all of that. And then apparently there was a window. He was down on the ground floor, and there was a window that because of the heat, he would have it open. And as they would walk by, Muslim prisoners would spit at him, or in some cases apparently throw excrement in his window, which, needless to say, would be a pretty horrific thing in a jail cell to which you are confined 23 hours a day. So this is a case where it seemed, Jim, that the British government was not only interested in kind of torturing him, but possibly putting him in mortal peril, all for having had the temerity to stand up for British values and liberties and accountability for real horrible crimes against British women and girls.
Now, in this day and age, of course, it is always necessary to determine the bona fides of an individual? Because I'm sure that you used the term earlier. I'm sure that around Tommy Robinson, the term Islamophobe has popped up. He hates everybody who's a Muslim, anybody who wears a turban or anything like that. I'm sure that he's been painted as some wild-eyed radical. So for the record, what is his stance on that subject?
Well, I think he was initially moved by just what he saw as outrageous against Western civilization and society. He was imprisoned for a previous offense, according to the British government. And interestingly, he was confined to solitary incarceration for a protracted period of time. And during that time, he really studied the Quran and the Hadiths and the other sacred texts of Islam. And he came out of it very knowledgeable about what was motivating the people who, as I say, I think are best described as adherents to Sharia and who believe that it's called to jihad and the domination of others, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, is the way, as it's called, the path that Allah has, determined for all faithful Muslims. So I don't think he's an Islamophobe by any means. That literally meaning somebody who has an unreasoned fear of Islam or Muslims. This is a man who has gone to school on things that are actually frightening. Unfortunately, again, not all Muslims embrace this Sharia code or seek to impose it on the rest of us, but plenty do. And he's quite properly alarmed by them and raising that alarm with the rest of us.
I certainly am failing to understand why the British should have gone, at least their government should have gone so totally politically correct that they would not try to protect their citizens from things such as assault and rape, for Pete's sake. I mean, it's one thing to be, quote, tolerant of other cultures, quote, unquote. That does not include the behavior of savages.
Indeed. I think what's going on, Jim, and unfortunately it's not limited to Britain. You see it elsewhere in Europe, and frankly, we see some of it in our own country as well. There is a growing sense of, fear, I think is the right word for it, on the part of the authorities, that if they challenge misbehavior, even criminal behavior, there may be, rioting or violence of other kinds, terrorism aimed at them or other, citizens. And it seems to come down to the fact that, yes, they knew about these rape gangs. Yes, they were aware that thousands of young British women and girls were being, as I say, brutalized in this fashion. And they did nothing about it. My sense is because they were pretty well convinced that were they to arrest these people, were they to try them, were they to throw them into jail, there may well have been mayhem on their hands, and it was better just to sort of ignore it and try to hope for the best that the rest of the society would not be brutalized too.
That's got to be the lamest thing I've ever heard. Now, there has been something that made the rounds on the Internet, and of course these days that falls under who knows what category, all the way from confirmed fact down to outrageously made up. But this thing that has made the rounds of the Internet has to do with a statement purportedly made by the Prime Minister of Australia, and I've never really been in a situation where I felt it necessary to check it out on various websites to see if it's legitimate. Supposedly, the Prime Minister of Australia laid down the law to people, saying that if you came to Australia, you would abide by their norms, that you would not engage in such behavior, and if you didn't like it, then you were free to leave. Do you happen to know if there's any truth to that?
I think this is an urban legend. I've not run it to earth myself, but I believe that one thing that should be said about the Australians is that they have essentially closed their borders to refugees and migrants and others coming there without permission. But I think that formulation was a little bit beyond what actually was said by the Prime Minister.
Easier to do, of course, when you're surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. All right, we're going to continue to talk with Frank Gaffney this evening about a variety of issues, and certainly that includes Tommy Robinson. Again, speaking the truth about anything, even if it's painful, should not be in the category of forbidden discussion. I mean, if the shoe fits, as they say. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. We'll be back on the Bohannon Show in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show with Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy. Always a pleasure to have Frank on the program, and a number of things that he's written about of late that I want to try to get on. But to continue the story of Tommy Robinson, part of the problem can be spelled out very simply by simply quoting from the NewYorkTimes.com, an article by one Palco Carraz. And I'll just read you the headline and then the first sentence. Headline: Tommy Robinson, anti-Muslim activist, is freed on bail in UK. Lead sentence. Tommy Robinson, the jailed British far-right activist, backed by former Trump aide Steve Bannon, but reviled by others who call him a violent purveyor of hate, was ordered to be freed on bail Wednesday. That says about all you need to say about Palco Carraz and others from that particular publication and the grubby political wares they often peddle. Your thoughts on that, Frank?
Jim, I think I wish that it were an isolated characterization of Tommy. Unfortunately, that's been pretty much the standard treatment he's received from not only his own nation's press, but ours and others around the world. And you know, I having been subjected to some of this myself, I have to say, the thing that is so galling about it is it's clearly a response to I think an unwillingness to come to grips with an unpleasant reality.
Oh, yes.
I wouldn't presume to speak for Tommy, but I can tell you for myself, I would much rather be proven wrong about the concerns that I'm expressing, and I think Tommy is articulately as well, about this phenomenon of the supremacism of Sharia adherence. And it does not serve our country, or for that matter, the free world, to pretend the thing that we hope isn't true and ignore it as a result. And it falls to those of us who strap it on to talk about these things and to think them through and to raise the warning about them, to suffer these criticisms. But it doesn't make our points any less valid. It's just that we're being told we can't talk about them, and the public is I believe, being very badly served by efforts to suppress it.
Terribly, terribly badly served. It's just amazing, the notion here that we will stick our heads in the sand. Are these people so wrapped up in the concepts of diversity and inclusivity that they cannot come to grips with this? I mean, the way you phrased it, I really think you're probably right. Oh, I hate reality. I just can't come to grips with that. I think that we all should be holding hands and singing Kumbaya. I mean, yes, we would all like that, but have we really reached the point that people in responsible positions in government and in major journalistic outlets will actually pretend this is so?
Evidently, you know, the interest in diversity is selective, as you have observed. I know, Jim. If you happen to have a view at odds with the accepted party line, inclusiveness does not extend to you.
No, I mean, Frank Gaffney would be a diverse viewpoint in many of these circles of acquaintance, and yet I dare say that they aren't anxious to get diverse with you, are they?
Not so much, no. And
so
again,
much, no.
The thing that has become most alarming to me, and I know you've been covering it a lot, as you should, is the extent to which organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center have become the arbiters of not just what kind of infamy I'm subjected to, but whether people can actually have access to the sorts of information that I, or for that matter, Tommy Robinson, or a great many others are trying to expose them to, on the grounds that it's hate speech or it's offensive, it's a blasphemy. Sharia blasphemy is really what it comes down to in many cases, to point out truths, but inconvenient ones, and ones that might prompt some in the Muslim community specifically to act aggressively.
Again, the notion that would be a basis for not enforcing the simple laws of civilized society, that's rather bizarre and frankly very, very frightening. But be that as it may, that apparently is where we are now in a lot of arenas. Just before we move on to some of the topics I wanted to bring up, some of them semi-related topics, but we often hear stories of how Europe is rolling over and playing dead and inviting their culture to essentially disappear before the 21st century is out. One time on this program, I asked a person some years ago, I said, after Pakistan, what will be the next Islamic nuclear power? He replied, France. So I'm wondering, other portions of Europe who have also been subjected to often uncontrolled and certainly non-assimilated populations, how are they dealing with this? Have any of them come to their senses, or are they literally willing to just simply enter into a zone of barbarism?
Or a no-go zone, as the case may be. Actually, a point of clarification, I think it may be Russia that is the next Muslim nuclear power, and a superpower at that. It's a chilling thought, but the demographic situation, I think, in Russia is even more fragile, shall we say, than in France. But here's the thing, Jim. I think if you look around Europe, you'll find, there's my old friend Don Rumsfeld used to say there's old Europe and there's new Europe, and he was pretty much talking about the old Europeans as Western Europe, mostly the nations that have been free basically since we liberated them in World War II. And then there's the relatively newcomers to freedom that were liberated after the Berlin Wall fell and the end of the Soviet Empire. And in Western Europe, things are desperate, I think is the only way to describe it, with people who are very much under the thrall of this fear of Islamic terror or simply upheavals, and therefore appeasing them. And I think in the process, yes, putting in grave peril their civilization, their values, their countries. And then there's the new Europeans. They are resisting rather bravely. They're refusing to take in more immigrants that will not assimilate and that will demand these sorts of changes in their country.
Well, we're coming up on a break here that doesn't move, so I want you to continue that thought, and then we'll shift to a few others on The Bohannon Show. Frank Gaffney, the guest, in just a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. We're talking with Frank Gaffney. He is the founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Security Policy, their website, centerforsecuritypolicy.org. We've taken a look at the case of Tommy Robinson, who has pointed out some of the vicious, felonious behavior that some, not all, some of the Muslim immigrants to Britain have conducted, and behavior which apparently some take as part and parcel of their faith. Again, not all. And the way in which he's been treated both by the government and, as the quote I gave a moment ago from the New York Times, which ought to know better, again, a refusal to accept unpleasant truths. So, I note something that you sent out here. President Trump empowers regime change in Iran. I'd like to discuss that first from the standpoint of the wording put out by the White House, which was that the new sanctions on Iran are aimed not at regime change but behavior change. Your take?
Well, I take them at their word. I'm a great admirer of President Trump and the Vice President and National Security Advisor John Bolton. I think these are people who, along with Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, are very serious about dealing with the threats that this country is facing. And with respect to Iran, I think Donald Trump has been particularly clear-eyed about that problem long before he came to office. And what he has done is rip up what I call the Obama bomb deal, tremendously one-sided, I call it a sellout, really, of American interests to the Iranian regime, helping prop them up. And he has instead said, we're going to go back to the kind of regime that was in place before Barack Obama turned over $150 billion or so to the mullahs, some of it in pallets of cash, no less, in exchange for not much more than empty promises. And the sanctions that are now being put in place will, I believe, effect change. My guess is that given what's going on in the streets of Iran at the moment and the desperation of the people there to get out from under the despotic Sharia supremacist, again, regime that is literally causing many of them to have lack even of water, let alone livelihoods, is such that we may well see a policy that is supposed to just result in behavior modification may actually result in regime change. I certainly hope so.
Well, I certainly hope so. To be perfectly frank, although I back many of the things that the president tries to do, but I certainly have had my criticisms, and some of them come to roost right here. I think that the president gets a little overly optimistic about his power of personal persuasion or negotiation, as I'm sure he would put it, with the likes of Kim Jong-un or President Rouhani of Iran or Vladimir Putin of Russia. I'm not so sure that that necessarily is going to happen. I suppose, for example, his discussions with Kim Jong-un could probably fall into the category of chicken soup. That is to say, in terms of chicken soup, the universal remedy for everything, it can't hurt. But I'm not so sure that it's going to do much more than that. And I wish at times that he would adopt a little more, shall we say, clear-eyed vision. And surrounded by people like John Bolton, I'm wondering why he resists that.
Well, I'm not certain that he's resisting it so much as I think he may not be giving it as much attention as it warrants. And I would make a distinction, Jim, between the policy that he's following with respect to Iran and the policy that he's experimented with respect to North Korea. So just to stay with Iran for a moment, I think that he is essentially following the Bolton plan. John Bolton was very clear before he took on this new job that he thought withdrawal from the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was necessary, and a reimposition of sanctions was required, and an effort to align ourselves very explicitly with the people of Iran, rather than help this regime or legitimate it, was the way to go. So I think the president has been heeding and pretty faithfully implementing a sensible strategy towards Iran in light of the threat that it represents. I take your point and share your misgivings, quite honestly. And in fact, I'm writing a piece about it right now. What Samuel Johnson once described as second marriage is the triumph of hope over experience. We've had a lot of horrible experience with the North Koreans, and it's not panning out very well at the moment. No. It's more of the same.
No, I had a discussion on this program one night with George Mitchell about the Iran nuclear deal, and I asked him, where in this document does it prevent Iran from doing anything? And he really weaseled and waffled, and I said, sir, honestly, that response is not, frankly, up to your usual standards. And I said, look, if in fact the backers of this deal really believe that, there's just no way we can prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but maybe if we bribe them with so much money that we become the world's largest funder of terrorism, we might make them postpone their nuclear weapons acquisition for a few decades, a relatively minor period of time in the way that they think. If you really thought that was the best deal you could get, intellectual honesty, I think, would demand that you sell it that way, but not make up this nonsense about it preventing anything. And frankly, he didn't really have much of a response, which kind of disappointed me. I rather thought he would do a better job of defending it, but he didn't.
Well, it was indefensible. Is the simple truth of the matter, Jim, and you nailed it. And frankly, I have watched him bob and weave over the years, as you have, and I'm surprised that he wasn't up to it. But your cross-examination was obviously too much for him. But in point of fact, I haven't overstated, I think, the problem. We gave an immense amount of money up front, which evidently has been entirely ripped off, presumably to the Swiss bank accounts of the kleptocrats who run the country. It certainly hasn't done what we were promised it would, which is to, help improve the condition of the Iranian people and try to turn their country into a normal member of the so-called international community, 21st century nation, and so on. None of that has happened.
Really? I mean, seriously, are you actually saying that, in fact, it has been spent by the mullahs on their personal well-being? I mean, honestly, as dishonest as that is, it certainly beats funding Hezbollah. I mean, I in a way, I'm pleased by that word.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint. $150 billion is a lot to stash.
It sure is.
So some of it has migrated to Hezbollah. Some of it is propping up Bashar Assad in Syria. Some of it is funding the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Some of it is promoting hegemonism and subversion, not only in that region, but in our own, as a matter of fact. So a lot of it is wound up in very bad places, but some of them are Swiss bank accounts, I think, as well. And this is part of what's driving the people of Iran to the present fury, where they're as I pointed out in my piece the other day, they've replaced the chant that they were, endlessly required to repeat: death to America, death to Israel, with death to the dictator.
We're going to come back and we're going to take a call and do some other discussion. But briefly, as we go to the break here, are you saying the Green Revolution has been resurrected?
It's actually better than that. It's not just the Green Revolution, which was a relatively small subset of the population. This is really across the population, and therefore I think it's got a better prospect of success.
More to come. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show, 1-866-50-JIMBO with Frank Gaffney. He's the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, their website, centerforsecuritypolicy.org. And one other thing before we talk about another country, we talked about Iran, another country in that neck of the woods. But I understand it when I see people with an agenda who are pursuing their ends. I don't agree with it. I don't agree with using, for example, government tax dollars in this country to support an ultra-leftist point of view, but at least I understand it. There's a consistency to that. But for the life of me, why members of the left who promote things like women's liberation would be in league with the most fascistic dark age philosophy on the planet today, which would go after them first and foremost if they got the chance. That I just don't understand, Frank.
It is inexplicable. The only thing I can tell you, Jim, is that as best I can tell, and you're, of course, speaking, I think, here of this phenomenon of Sharia supremacism, which is institutionalized misogyny. Women abuse, women mistreatment, women hatred of the first order. And the only explanation I can give you is that in the hierarchy of the left these days, women are no longer the most important victim class. Even all of those people in the LGBTQ, whatever community, are no longer the preeminent victim class. The top class,
who also are particularly loved by fundamentalist Islam,
would also be put to the knife. Exactly right.
Yes.
The most, preferred or most feared or most, lauded victim class, according to the left these days, seems to be Muslims. And I can't explain it exactly other than to say that either it's that they're sharing, particularly the hard left, they're sharing the desire that many in this community, the Sharia supremacist part of that community I'm speaking of, have in terms of eliminating our country, removing it, as the impediment to the realization of their global totalitarian designs. And to be sure, the so-called democratic socialists and the communists and the Alinskyites and the rest on the left have a different end state in mind for their totalitarian overthrow of our constitutional republic than do the Islamist or Sharia supremacists. But they're willing to make common cause to remove us as the impediment to their ambitions.
Let me offer an alternative theory, and that is that they are just desperately seeking moral superiority. Anything that can prove that they're better than other people. I had a caller one time to this program ask me to distill liberal thought to one sentence, and I said, okay, I can do that. Are you ready? Here goes. It's not easy being better than everybody else, but I try. And I think that is the essence of the motivation here, that they are so desperate to show moral superiority. It's their whole raison d'etre. This is their reason for living, and even they're so desperate that at times they will seek positions which are morally indefensible, just to try and prove how much better they are than everybody else. But be that as it may, that's where we find ourselves.
Well, look, I think you've put basically what I was trying to say much more elegantly, and that's why they pay you the big bucks to be a rock star on talk radio.
Yeah.
I think you were capturing the point. It's about moral supremacy, which is rooted in your ability to hold up the victim, and we're on the same page, Jim.
All right, more to come. We'll continue our discussion with Frank Gaffney in just a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show. Our guest is Frank Gaffney from the Center for Security Policy. And in the same neighborhood as Iran, in fact, bordering that country, is the nation of Turkey, one of the founding members of NATO, part of the bulwark against expansion of the Soviet Union into Western Europe, a country which had, under Kemal Ataturk, following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, had become the very model of what one would call Islamic reform, a Muslim state, predominantly Muslim state, in which there were any number of concessions to civilized behavior. You could look to Turkey back then and say, well, if that could happen in these other countries, then the world would be a much better place. Well, I'll read the headline from this latest missive from Frank Gaffney. sanction Turkey an ally no more. Please tell us more.
As you know, Jim, the transformation that has taken place, I guess Barack Obama would have called it a fundamental transformation of Ataturk's secular, albeit Muslim, republic into truly an Islamist one under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey now, has converted an important ally, as you say, a bulwark for the free world against various adversaries, notably the Soviet Union, but also Iran and threats beyond, into a country that is actually aligned with Iran and Russia and China, and ever more hostile towards ourselves and towards NATO and towards Israel and other friendly nations on our team. And this is a point that I think can't be emphasized often or firmly enough. Ignoring that reality, continuing to treat continuing to treat Turkey as though it is an ally, to give it access to our secrets, our intelligence, our weapon systems, notably the F-35, our top-line fighter system, at the very moment that its behavior is becoming more and more aggressively hostile, and its dealings with the Russians, including acquiring an advanced S-400 anti-aircraft system from them, is just reckless and I think downright dangerous. So I think being clear that it is an ally no more, and taking steps in the case of what the president did the other day of sanctioning a couple of Turkish officials over their refusal to stop the horrific mistreatment of an American pastor, Andrew Brunson, is just, a precursor to the sorts of changes I think are required now in American policy towards Turkey.
I've heard it said that perhaps the reforms of Kemal Ataturk were a bit exaggerated, and that outside of the principal cities of Ankara and Istanbul, that in the countryside, Turkey had always been pretty much Islamist in attitude. Is that true?
I think it's fair to say that in places where there was not a great deal of Western mores adopted and practiced, and more broadly, realignment with the West that Ataturk was all about. Yes, and it wasn't so much that they were Islamist as they were Sharia supremacists. They were part of the tradition of Islam that the authorities hold as the correct practice of the faith. What they have found in Erdogan, though, is someone who would take their agenda, their practice of the faith, their drive for jihad, which Sharia commands, to the cities and indeed to the government, and to impose it as the policy of Turkey as a whole. And that's a fundamental change that is again, very far-reaching in its implications.
Frank Gaffney, stay on the line, please, and we'll speak off air. He is a national security expert, the founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Security Policy, online at their name, centerforsecuritypolicy.org. He is the lead author of War Footing, 10 Steps America Must Take to Prevail in the War for the Free World, and co-author of Sharia, The Threat to America, and See No Sharia, Countering Violent Extremism. I'm Jim Bohannon, and this is Westwood One.